lots of personal involvement. So, no, she we know you're too young to have any personal involvement. But
I was down mines, working in cotton mills.
so, if you are near here, the toilet's just inside that door on the right hand.
Fabulous.
Over to you, Kelly.
Right, over we go. Thank you very much. And I do just want to show off, I finally got myself a fancy clicker thing. So I'm not going to be here going, excuse me, while I'm trying to do the slides. This is where it'll all completely go wrong. But hopefully the clicky thing is going to work. So welcome, thank you all for coming. And it is lovely to see some new faces. Hopefully you'll go skipping out of here and go, can't wait for the next one. And so tonight is about Oldham's cotton mills, and it has been a huge subject, because I'll be honest, I mean, I'm a historian, but I've never been an expert on Oldham's cotton mills. It's just not something I've particularly researched. And I was saying to a few of you who got here earlier, my goodness, I mean, I've just fallen down so many rabbit holes. There is so much information, so many fascinating aspects to Oldham's incredibly rich cotton history. But I had to be quite ruthless about what I included, because we either had a 5-hour talk, you know, or like nobody goes home till Saturday, and I thought nobody wants that. You know, I am, you know, obviously it's going to be good talk. Well, that's very true. I'm like a tickle stick. So I have had to be quite ruthless, but I hope there's still something in there for everybody. I hope you do enjoy it. Spoiler alert, if you come for a half-hour discussion about James Watts's steam engine, you're going to be disappointed, okay? It features, it's a cameo appearance, okay? But it is in there. So this is a shot, I'm going to show, look, got my thumbs, I'm so excited about this, best thing I've bought from Amazon. So this is a shot, I don't know exactly when, it was just early 20th century of Oldham, you know, I mean, that's just absolutely bonkers. So I don't know Oldham well enough to know kind of where this was taken from. There was a church just there. I don't know if anybody recognises this viewpoint, but that is Oldham, early 20th century. Just a few mills going on there. Okay, so, agenda. So I'm going to give you a brief overview, except it's not a very brief overview actually, and I will be really quite clear. If there's a section that's quite long, it means I really enjoyed doing that research. If it's quite short, it means I found it less of an interest. But it's still there, So I'll give you an overview of Oldham's cotton industry, cotton heritage. Why Oldham, I think, is a really important question, okay, because as you'll see, you know, Oldham wasn't just a big player when it came to cotton. Oldham was the player when it came to cotton, okay? But why? Why this little northern town? A bit of how mills were powered. This I found fascinating, who designed the mills. Really fascinating. So, quick spoiler, that's the wrong section, but it's really good. We're going to have a look at who did what in a cotton mill, the Factory Act. There were approximately 72 million of these in the 19th century, so I'm going to give you a very high-level overview of them. They were important. Lancashire cotton famine. Anybody heard of that?
Yeah.
Yeah? I'll have a sit down then. I'll invite someone else up. And then when Gandhi came to town, yes, which really fascinated me. So that's what we're going to whiz through. So I'm going to start with this quote I found. If ever the Industrial Revolution placed a town firmly and squarely on the map of the world, that town is Oldham. And I just don't think it could have been truer if it tried. So at its peak, how many mills, cotton mills, do you think Oldham had at its absolute peak? Loads, definitely loads.
20.
No,
I'd say probably about 40 to 50 now.
I would say about 150.
150? 200?
300,000.
Not quite. Love the enthusiasm there, but I think even Oldham would have gone, that's enough. So over 450 mills at its peak, okay? They ran day and night, and Oldham was the leading cotton spinning manufacturer in the world in the second half of the 19th century. So not just the leading cotton producer in the UK or Europe, but the leading cotton producer in the entire world, which isn't bad for a small town with a population of 12,000 people in 1801. About 100 or so of these 450 mills still survive. You know, some have been repurposed. There are sadly lots that are just crumbling away. but there's about 14 that are actually grade 2 listed. So that's really good, because I think they're beautiful, absolutely beautiful. It's just a shame so many have, you know, been demolished over the years. So the first cotton mill was built in Oldham in 1778 at Leeshorn, and it was built by Mr. William Clegg. A year later, there were 12 mills in total. 1818, there were 19 cotton mills in Oldham, so it was a not particularly swift rate of growth. By 1838, there were 213 cotton mills, but there was an absolute mill building boom in the 1860s and 1870s, and that's when Oldham really was put on the map. In 1928, the last mill was built in Oldham. Do you know what that one was?
Elm.
Yes, absolutely. And it was the largest textile factory built in the UK, and it was here in 1998 that the very last cotton in Oldham was spun. So I haven't been able to find an image of Lee's Hall. I don't know how long it was up for, but so this was Elk Mill, before the shopping centre that we know and love. And when it opened, it employed over 400 people, and the owners were actually considered, and this is important when we can come to the Factory Act later, but the owners were considered to be very good, very ethical, and very caring. You know, 1920s, not bad, but yeah, that is Elk Mill. So at its peak, Oldham was the leading cotton spinning manufacturer in the world. So I'm going to put that into some context. Oh, don't let me down. There we go. Do you know what these are? Spindles. Absolutely. Going to throw some figures at you here. So cotton spindles, absolutely, pretty much the most important, the essential part of the entire machinery in the mill. And in 1911, there were 58 million spindles in the UK, and there were about 143 million spindles in the world. Didn't fancy that job, counting those. And 16.5 million of these spindles were in Oldham mills. So just under 30% of all spindles in the UK were in Oldham, and about 10% of all spindles in the world were in Oldham. So really just kind of put it into context, thinking about these little things and just how many of them were. So in 1851, an average, if a town had a textile sector, about 5% of that town's population would be working in it. In Oldham, over 30% of the town's population worked in the cotton industry, a massive source of employment and hugely important to the local economy. And so I mentioned in 1801, Oldham had a population of 12,000 people. Due to this explosion in the cotton industry, by the 1861, that population had grown to 72,000. And by 1901, the population was 137,000. You know, that massive increase in just 100 years. And just in case you're wondering, the present population of Oldham is 242,000 people. Maybe give or take, but around there. But unfortunately, in the 20th century, the cotton industry as a whole started to decline in the UK, and by 1964, Oldham had ceased to be the worldwide centre of cotton spinning, but they kept that title for an awfully long time. And as I said, the very last Oldham cotton was spun in 1998, when the last mill closed. So, you know, this is all, I think, really fascinating information about how important Oldham was, how successful it was, but it does beg that question: why Oldham? What was it about this town that put it in such a position to be the leading cotton manufacturer in the world? So Oldham had always had a thriving textile industry. So the land around Oldham, it wasn't suitable for like industrial agriculture, you know, growing crops and whatnot. So there'd always been a lot of the land given over to sheep grazing for wool. So there'd always been that textile industry, with a lot of the cottage industries, so, you know, just very small places with, you know, one, maybe two people working there. And a lot of silk was actually produced in Manchester and Oldham in the 18th century. Manchester, you know, was a major textile hub anyway. But in the late 18th century, there's a growing demand for cotton, and Oldham became very popular for building mills. So there's several reasons for this, okay, one of which is the weather. Yeah? So I actually moved here from Lincolnshire 20 years ago. Lincolnshire is actually quite a dry place. It gets an average of 1.7 inches of rain each year, about 110 rainy days. Everyone warned me when I moved here it would do nothing but rain. I'm just throwing that out there, and they were pretty much right. Oldham gets an average of almost 3.5 inches of rain a year, and it has about 175, 180 rainy days on average, so it's a much wetter place. But this is perfect for cotton. The damp atmosphere stops the fibres drying out and snapping when they're being spun, having that dampness in the air. It wasn't just the weather, it's also transport links. So in 1796, the branch of the Ashton Canal was completed, and that helped the local collieries get their cheap fuel to the cotton mills, to all the textile factories. And railways, massively important in the cotton industry. And in 1842, the Oldham branch of the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway was completed. So prior to that, so between the 1780s and the 1820s, canals provided the most reliable form of transport for the raw materials to come in and the produced goods to go out. But then by 1845, the railway completely usurped the canals, and it meant that cotton could get to the mills much quicker, and then we could get it out into Liverpool for export super quickly. So it was the existing textile industry that we had in Oldham, the weather, coal, lots of cheap fuel in the area, and the transport links that led to that flourishing cotton industry in Oldham. It was just like the perfect storm all came together right here. And so then looking at how mills were powered, so all early mills, pretty much whatever they produced, were powered by either animals, usually horses or donkeys, or water. Early cotton mills were no exception. So James Watt had patented his steam engine in 1769, and by 1789 or so, it was actually becoming more widely used in factories, in the textile factories. But it wasn't universally used. This again was best suited to areas that had access to lots of cheap fuel, which, you know, Oldham did, and could easily move goods by land and water. Well, we've seen we've got the cheap fuel, we've got the canal, we've got the railway links. And so, you know, Oldham was perfectly situated to make the most of this newfangled innovation, this steam engine. And the first mill to use a steam engine in Oldham was on Broadway Lane between 1790 and 72. Lees Hall, which had built the first cotton mill in Oldham, they built a second one, their hire mill, and they were using one in 1794. And then over the next few years, it became much more widely used. And so the impact of the steam engine meant, well, I mean, it revolutionised textile production. It was incredibly reliable, a very efficient source of power, you know, for the machinery that was used for the spinning and weaving, which meant we could move away from those small cottage industries and into these much larger mills because we had the means of keeping them powered and producing all this lovely cotton. And in the 20th century, most mills moved away from the steam engine and moved on to, you know, electric motors as things became a bit more modernised in the 20th century. So moving on to who designed the mills, and there are some names that you come across time and time again. So you've got the Stotts, and there were loads of them. I mean, there were just so many Stotts. You've got Abraham, Philip, Joseph, George, you know, just to name a few. And you also had Edward Potts, and you also had Frederick Dixon. And, you know, so there are other names that come up, but again, in the interest of keeping this talk, hopefully, running to time, I'm going to concentrate on the Stotts and Edward Potts with a quick detour via Frederick Dixon, okay? So Stott and Sons, they were like the architectural firm when it came to like the cotton industry. So their practice was established in 1847 in Clegg Street. They specialised in designing cotton mills. So it started by Abraham Stott. His brother Joseph joined the firm shortly after. 3 of Abraham's 9 children came to work at the firm, a real family endeavour. They designed 191 buildings, 130 of which were either cotton mills or related to the cotton industry. Like I said, they were absolutely the main player. Not necessarily the most productive, but certainly, I guess, that most highly regarded. If it was a Stott mill, that was good. But, you know, the firm declined in the 20th century along with the cotton industry, and they closed in 1931. So I said at the beginning there were over 450 mills at Oldham's peak. Now, I'm not going to talk about it. I would actually love to. If anybody wants me to do a talk on all 450 mills, I'm down for that. I really am. Because as I said, I think they're beautiful, genuinely. I have fallen in love with cotton mills, okay? I just think they're absolutely wonderful. And so I'm going to have some pictures to share with you. So I thought, well, I'll look at local mills, because, local interest. This is a local history talk. So I started with looking at local mills designed by Stott and Sons. So they had one on Dowry Street, just up the road, built in 1907. It produced cotton until 1933, was used as a demob centre during World War II. Do you know what it is now?
Business centre.
Yeah, it's a business centre with dance studio.
It is the Earl Business Centre. So, cotton mill, built in 1907 by the Stotts. And then you had Maple Mill 1 and 2 on Cardwell Street. Oh, I love it. Yeah, good. So these were designed as a double mill. First opened in 1904, second opened in 1915. So spinning ceased in the 1990s, and the mills were actually destroyed by fire in 2009 and 2016. So the site was completely cleared in 2011. So I've got a clip. I've gone really tech on this one. A clip of the 2016 fire. Dodgy?
Yeah.
Oh! Am I sensing some local gossip?
It was a kitchen place.
Lance Mill.
Oh, Lance Miller.
Ah, because
Yeah.
this was, we moved to Oldham later in 2016, so obviously we missed this, but I love that. Dodgy. Oh, where did that go? But it was just like the intensity of it. I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but I mean it's... So did some of you see that? Yeah.
I only lived down the road from there.
You could see that from our monuments on the avenue.
Oh, I bet you could, yeah?
It was unreal.
But it's just got, it's such a dramatic sight, this huge old mill just being completely devoured in a dodgy fashion. When I next do this talk somewhere else, I'll put in there, local gossip. I'll be here.
Well, no, it's
Oh, sorry, let me just...
That's it. Might even see me on there.
Whilst it was a dodgy kitchen manufacturing place, my daughter and a couple of her friends worked there.
Yeah, my
Oh,
partner
really?
did as well. Yeah, that day she was there.
Really?
That's got all moved out. Yeah.
Well, apparently we're all for insurance.
Yeah. Well,
Oh, that's all insurance. Right, yes. I was about to say we've all been there. I mean, I didn't mean that for a second. I've never been anywhere down. I promise. I'm a historian, not an arsonist, okay? All been there. Right, okay. Well, that's really interesting. I love that. You see? Bit of extra local knowledge for it. I'm going to have to go back over here so I can actually read what I've written. Okay. Oh, it's all quite exciting. So yeah, that was Maple Mill. So we've got Devon Mill. Don't let me down. On Chapel Road, so that's still standing. So that was built in 1907, and it's now, I mentioned at the beginning, there are 14 of these. This is a Grade 2 listed building. So it is protected, whatever is going to happen with it, that is on Chapel Road.
yeah, it's a business centre now, isn't it?
Is it a business centre? Yeah.
Do it.
Very busy mill.
So perhaps the most local one to us, what would you say is the most local mill to us?
It's the one at the bottom on Ashton Ross. Ashton Ross.
Do you know, I'm thinking of one thing, but of course you all know the area. I don't massively. So I was hoping you were going to say the one where Park Cakes is.
No, Careful's.
Right. What's the second most local mill to us? You're right, the one where Park Cakes is. Yes, of course. I'm an incomer. I'm slowly getting there.
Actually, no, because in the Bright Light, that's a mill as well. What's Bright Light? The one behind Abershore Hotel.
Oh, yeah.
That's still there, that's
Bianchi, that one.
Right. So
So
let me rephrase this. One of the most local mills to us, was Honeywell Mill, designed by Joseph Stott, literally just up the road, and I thought really close. See, you get the locals involved, which is where Park Cakes is now. So that was built between 1874 and 1875 and extended in 1881. I love this slide. Just look at it.
Wow.
Just look at it. And that's Earl over there.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's it. And look, you've got the pub. It looks very nice there. No offence if this just being careful here. But I just absolutely, and look, this is all Fitton Hill.
Yeah.
You know, it's absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
You know,
that pub built then.
And it's the two little lakes there.
The reservoir.
the reservoirs.
That was been for the
Mill Pond.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that
which is now
stood there.
the allotments. Them puddles, they're the allotments now.
So there's also this photo. So this is from 1947.
Wow.
This is from the 50s. Hello, pub.
Oh my God.
Looking all smart and spruce. But okay, so that's in the 1950s. So this, it actually, so by the time of this one, it had actually closed down. It closed down at the beginning of World War II. And it was sold in 1946 to Dunlop Rubber for £42,000.
Wow.
And it was actually destroyed by fire on the 9th of February 1955. This was kind of the best shot I could find of it, but that's it burning down. Clearly there's nothing on YouTube from that one. Get your mobile phones out in 1955. So, but that's the Honeywell Mill, or I guess Dunlop Rubber, I guess, burning down in 1955. And then you had a petrol station, which some of you probably remember was built on the front. Park Cake had the land behind and then bought the land on front and is the Park Cakes we all know and love today. So that was the Stotts, and then we're going to move on to Edward Potts. I don't think it was the law that your surnames had to rhyme if you're in the cotton building industry, but Edward Potts it is. So he is massively regarded as one of the great cotton mill architects in Lancashire. He actually designed over 200 mills. He was a Methodist. He also designed many Methodist chapels. He also designed Oldham Infirmary, a later development of Oldham Town Hall, Blackpool Town Hall, and a later kind of extension to Manchester Corn Exchange. So not just cotton mills. He actually had various firms. Potts, Pickup and Dixon designed Belgrave Mills, numbers 1 to 4, on Honeywell Lane. Belgrave 1 was built in 1881. 2, 3 and 4 were built in the early 20th century and was probably the largest single-site complex of mills in Oldham. So it's still used for industrial premises, but not all the mills and not all the buildings still stand, but so that's still there. And Edward Potts, interestingly, missed one. So as Potts' son and Hennings, he designed Iris Mill on Holland Road. I don't know if you've heard of that.
Yeah.
So that was built on the site of the Hathershaw Mill, which had actually been destroyed by fire in 1907. Iris Mill went up in the same year that burnt down. It only took 4 months to build it. They threw these mills up. And that was used as a cotton mill until 1962, when production ceased. Later used by Thomas Glover & Co. to manufacture fire extinguishers. No, I know actually, I heard that time. I practiced this 70 million times and I finally heard it. So I couldn't find an image of Iris Mill. Well, a particularly clear one, not like this. But, okay, so this, I was about to point, I've got this. So this is Honeywell, this is from the back. Okay, so there's the pub, that's Ashton Road. This is Iris Mill. And that's the only photo that I could find. Built in 4 months. I mean, they probably added little bits, but they had it certainly built to be up and running within 4 months. They weren't messing about. This is cotton, people. We are not hanging around with it. So thinking about the fire extinguishers, so Edward Potts, he didn't just design cotton mills, he was actually a proponent of fireproof floors, fireproof ceilings, and unlike his contemporaries, he built much thicker concrete floors. His were at 7 inches. His competitors were designing buildings that were absolutely functional, but he made them thicker to give them that extra fireproof safety. They were more rigid, and so they needed more supporting columns, and his designs are quite a large part responsible for a lot of the features still used in modern office blocks and apartment buildings from what he was doing with his cotton mills 150 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, absolute bonkers. And so then we move on to Frederick Whitaker Dixon. So he was part of Potts, Pickup and Dixon, but he left to establish his own firm in 1889. So he wasn't as prolific as the other architects. He designed 12 cotton mills between 1891 and 1906, and then his son joined the firm and he designed a further 11. So they designed Hertford Mill in Werneth, which was built in 1907, closed in 1959, was used by the Littlewoods mail order catalogue company as a warehouse until 1992. So it was demolished in 2020, and I really like this. I've got a little clip of the chimney being brought down. There must be a more efficient way of doing this. I'll work on that.
That's going to be within the next 5 minutes now. Senior officers. Can you calm down now?
It's basically just people go, yay, for the next 5 minutes. But I mean, that is clinical. It's almost like they know what they're doing when they bring these down, because I'm watching it going, go on, just go like that.
That's what he did though.
But it's...
You got used to see him coming down
Yeah,
on
it's what he
5
did.
Yeah.
Was it called Disney?
It's just, I don't know, I find it quite sad. I mean, I appreciate there's 450 mils in Oldham back in the day. We probably just couldn't have them all just lying around now, we are 21st century, and it's lovely that we do have some left. But I don't know, I mean, I found it a mix of, that's a really cool thing to see, but also, that's history, that is history. So let me get back on to the slides. There we go. Lovely. Oh no, can't see. There we go. So yeah, there are way more architects that I could share with you, but interesting time. I'm going to move on to the next part of my talk. If there's anybody who would like me to do a talk or put together something, more information about the actual mills, I am more than happy to, okay? I do, however, have to mention some other mills that I know mean something to a couple of people sitting in the room tonight. So Wendy, you shared with me that your mum and your aunt worked at Rugby Mill in Chadderton.
Yeah.
That one.
Wow.
There we go. So this was built in 1908 by Dixon and Son. So it wasn't just thrown together. We had the numero uno, one of the big players in cotton mill design. So built in 1908, it's continued spinning until 1985 when it closed. The chimney was actually 150 feet tall, one of the tallest. Sadly, that was demolished in 1992, and it has now sadly been demolished and the site cleared for industrial development. But again, just look at the architecture on it, and I love, they all had their names, just which I absolutely love. They're so proud, we are the Rugby Mill.
Yeah.
And you also told me about Raven Mill in Chadderton, where another of your aunts worked.
Yeah.
Look at that, proudly got Raven there. So this was built in 1907 by Sydney Stock. So this is the one that was from the numero uno players. Ceased production in 1959, became a mail order warehouse which it still is used for
Yeah.
today. But I just think what a brilliant example of it being repurposed.
Yeah.
You know, so it's still stood there proud, just in all its glory, built by the #1 firm of cotton mill architectures in the country. I'm going to say the world. Okay, I'm putting that out there, I'm saying that. But it's still being used. I just think it's absolutely wonderful. So thank you. That was really, really happy that you shared those with me. And then Kay, you told me that your grandmother worked at Mersey Mill.
Yeah.
This is one that caused me a bit of a headache, and I was emailing me, I can't find it. But I found it. About 5 minutes later, she got another one saying, I found it. It's all right. It's because street names have changed. So basically, Mersey Mill was on Mersey Street in Fellsworth. That's now Westminster Road. Okay, so the name has changed. Designed by Dixon and Son. Okay, built in 1908, ceased production in 1968, and was demolished in 1970. So again, like Iris Mill, I haven't found a particularly clear photo. Okay, but this is Failsworth, and this is Woodhouses, so just to give you kind of the orientation. And this was your grandmother's mill, right there. So this was taken in the 40s, this photo. So I don't know when your grandmother was working there, but
No, the way.
that's her mill. And it's just so lovely, you know, that these have such a local meaning to you guys. So I really appreciated you letting me know about those. So is there anything called Doreen here? No, a few because I couldn't find hers. So she told me about one, and it was called Willowbank Mill, and she said it was on Featherstone Roads. Featherstall.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why I didn't find it. Oh, I'm so glad she's not here. If you know Doreen, don't tell her. But I found one in Upper Mill, but I'm guessing that wouldn't ever be included as Oldham, would it? Upper Mill? No.
It's
Saddleworth.
So it might be. Well, if you know, tell her I didn't find it, if you know her. And no, don't tell her I didn't. Well, we don't say anything to Doreen. We'll just leave Doreen out of the loop.
Is that the one that turned into flats on Featherstone Road?
Featherstone. Oh, I didn't find it.
The one that's Featherstone Road.
Silly Kelly.
That's like an Asian business place, isn't it?
No, it is.
No, it is.
Well, I will go back and do a bit more research.
Yeah.
But Doreen also mentioned her grandfather's uncle, a chap called James Crinian, who was the chairman of the Cotton Workers' Union. So it was actually called the Cardering Workers Amalgamation, and that was in existence between 1886 and 1974. Represented workers in the cotton textile industry in Oldham, and it was known for being really aggressive in dealings with its employers, which I love the sound of. And it was successful in the 20th century for increasing wages for many of its members. And at its peak, it had 52,000 members. It merged with the Amalgamated Textile Workers' Union in 1974, which itself dissolved in 1985. But Doreen said that James lived on Lees Square in Bardsley, which is where Daisy Chains is now. And I do like the idea of a union firebrand living quite locally. That would be very useful. So yes. Okay, so that's all I can devote to the mills, and I said I absolutely loved it, discovered an absolute new passion. But we're going to move on to who did what in cotton mills. So it probably comes no surprise, men, women, children all worked in cotton mills. Loads of different jobs, and again, I keep saying this, it's beyond the scope of the time I have tonight to talk about all of them. But, so what I did, so I do a lot of research about people, about houses and that kind of thing. So I'm always knee-deep in censuses. And when I've done research locally, there are some jobs that come up time and time again of people who are working in the cotton mill. So I thought, well, I'll look at those ones because that is a local connection. I know people in Bardsley back then were doing these jobs in the cotton mill. So they're the ones that I've chosen, you know, to have a look at. So you had a carder.
Yeah.
This is a carding machine. Looks like a mangle to me. So the cotton arrived at the mill in raw, you know, large bales of raw cotton. So before it could be spun, it went through this carding machine to straighten the fibres to make them suitable for spinning. And the operator of this machine was a carder, and it was predominantly a male role. Then you had a mule spinner. So you've got a spinning mule, which threads a length of, which spins a length of thread at a time. So the machine moves forwards and backwards as the thread is spun. And the person operating this was called a mule spinner. Now, bits of fibre would fall on the floor, and obviously they didn't want that to go to waste. So it was the job of small children
to climb underneath.
to go underneath to collect the fibres so it didn't get wasted, and they were called mule scavengers. That was their name. As young as 5, these children. Incredibly dangerous work because they didn't stop the machines. Hello, Factory Acts, 19th century. But they didn't stop them. So the children had to dart in and out, and the mechanism often caught hair and clothing. And it was very common for fingers or whole hands to be lost. And lives. Children died in this machinery. However, so the mule spinner, usually a woman, they actually normally employed their own scavengers and paid them directly, and so very commonly they employed their own children to keep the money in the family, and I would imagine that hopefully made a lot of them a bit more careful, or about the situations their children would be getting into when collecting the fibres. You had an overlooker. This was the shop floor supervisor, like a middle manager. So he ensured basically that everything's running as it should and that no one's skiving. How very dare you. So I'd never come across this term before I did my talk on the colliery explosion, the diamond pit, where I was talking about the overlooker, who very conveniently missed the explosion by 15 minutes. So you had a more junior management role called an underlooker. And so depending on the size of the factory, there may just be one overlooker in charge of the whole thing, or you might have had different departments having their different managers. And of course, who do you think what sex was usually the managers? Of course it was the men. You had piecers. So piecers worked with spinning mules. So as well as fibres falling to the ground and being collected by the scavengers, quite often it would break during the spinning. So the piecer needed to go under and join them back together. Another incredibly dangerous job. So who do you think did it? Children. Of course it is. Get under there. You had the winder. So winders were responsible for loading empty bobbins onto the machines and removing them once they were full of thread, part of the spinning process. And again, this was mainly a female role.
You can actually still see all that going on at Quarry Bank Mill.
Yes, you can. Yes. I was going to reference it anyway, but the name completely went out of my mind. It is Quarry Bank Mill. Yes. And as you can imagine, working conditions weren't necessarily the best. So the mills themselves are hot and humid. Getting up to late 20s, early 30s in degrees. And because it needed to be to stop the threads from snapping. So the air was thick with cotton dust, again, you can imagine that, and it caused a lung disease which is called byssinosis, but is still referred to today as cotton worker's lung.
One of my aunts ended up with that.
Yeah.
Byssinosis,
Really? Yeah. So I think it was a lot like asthma or something, wasn't it? Yeah, just like a chronic lung disease, but still referred to as cotton worker's lung. And so workers routinely work 13-hour shifts, usually starting at 6 a.m. And because of the noise, I don't know if your relative mentioned the noise, but absolutely they had to become skilled lip readers, but a lot of them went deaf, from the pounding of this machinery. So you've got long hours, it's difficult work, it's not the greatest of conditions. So this is where the Factory Acts came in, and I might need to sit down during this bit because honestly, I'm not exaggerating, there were so many of them, and I'm sure I've missed some out. But this was to try and improve conditions. So it wasn't just the cotton mills, it was all textile factories. So from 1802, a vast series of these Factory Acts came into being. So, I mean, there were so many of them, but one of the reasons for them just being constantly new acts and new amendments is because the owners ignored them. So they kept having to reinforce them, but they weren't really being enforced in the first place. So, I mean, essentially, each act wanted to improve working conditions for those who worked in the cotton mills, especially children, especially those under the age of 13, okay? That was the primary focus. So they wanted to raise the minimum age, they wanted to enforce lunch breaks, because this is not a legal right, and they wanted to provide regular inspection of factories. But many mill owners were very unhappy with this, tried to repeal these acts, but when they did come into law, they just ignored them because it was very hard to actually enforce this new regulation. And genuinely, there was an actual reluctance. This really was an attitude. Remember, this is Victorians, okay? There was an attitude when it came to the children that, what are you complaining about? They saw that the factory conditions were actually way better than other jobs. You're not a chimney sweep, and at least you're not working in a coal mine. And so it was kind of, because you're not doing those horrible jobs, shut up complaining about this horrible job. That really was the attitude from an awful lot of people, not just the mill owners, which is why, again, so many of the laws that came in were ignored. So, it's going to be a really quick overview, but I've chosen the key points that I think you'll find interesting. The 1815 Act raised the minimum age finally to 9 for children.
Wow.
And made the maximum working day for those under 16, reduced it from 13 hours to 12 hours. Wow. Whoa, got an extra hour back.
How generous.
How generous, how generous. 1831, the maximum working day of 12 hours was extended to all up to 18-year-olds as well. So everyone's getting an hour back unless you're over 18. 1833, so for 9 to 12-year-olds, it made the maximum working day 8 hours. So we're definitely moving in the right direction. It was still 12 hours a day up to the age of 18. But it also stipulated that children under the age of 13 were to receive 2 hours of schooling a day as well. And it was in 1833 that they finally established a small inspectorate of factories. So we've been going back to 1802, but there's no way of enforcing it. So they finally established this inspectorate to go out to the factories to check that they're enforcing these new laws. However, there was over 4,000 textile factories in the country at the time. How many officers do you think, how many inspectors were employed? Slightly more than 1, but not much, 4. 4 inspectors. It's expected to go around 4,000 textile factories. So there was absolutely no way of rigorously checking that everything's being enforced. So many new laws just continue to be evaded, but it was the beginning, you know, of putting something which did eventually become a much more efficient system of, government control. So 1844, all dangerous machinery had to be fenced off. Brilliant. You know, we've only had mills for 50, 60 years. Let's finally do that. And no longer were you allowed to clean machinery while it was moving. Brilliant. For under 13s, it was now a maximum 6.5 hour day with 3 hours schooling. And the 12-hour day now applied to women, irrespective of age. 1847, maximum 10-hour working day for women and those under the age of 18. And then there was 1875, 1891, 1895, additional tweaks to the maximum working days. 1891 Act raised the minimum age to 11. And in 1901, the minimum age was raised to 12. And like I said, I mean, there's an awful lot more I could say about them. I mean, if anyone desperately wants to talk on the Factory Acts, I think there's other historians locally. But that was just, essentially, they wanted to improve conditions. It was just so difficult to get it enforced. You know, it's almost laughable if it hadn't been real. You know, if it hadn't been real people that were suffering with this. Okay, so I started this evening by talking about when times were booming for Oldham's cotton industry. And so the last 2 items on the agenda, cover periods when it wasn't quite so great. Okay, but interesting. So the Lancashire cotton famine I'd never heard of this. This was new to me. So in the 1850s, cotton producing boom in the UK, massive growth in production, cotton products were exported out of the UK all over the world. So at the beginning of the 1860s, British exports of cotton were worth then £35 million a year. Anyone care to guess what that would be worth in today's money? Yeah, just under £5 billion a year. So a little side note, the best quality raw cotton was called Sea Island, and this was grown off the coast, the southern states of America. Egyptian cotton was the second best quality, and now I get why people brag about Egyptian cotton bedding.
Yeah.
I never knew. I was like, mine's from Asda. You know, what is this? I'm 47 years old and I never knew why people brag, or maybe it's just our friends, Egyptian cotton. But now I'm like, oh, it's the second best. Oh, right, well, we're getting some, okay? This is my husband, by the way, for people who don't know. It's not some random man that I'm just propositioning with my posh new cotton sheets. So yeah, Egyptian cotton was the second best quality. That was actually made from a derivation of the Sea Island that had been exported to Egypt and was grown there, but I mean, it just wasn't produced in anything like the quantities of the Sea Island cotton off the southern states of America. So clearly, this boom in the UK, all this importing of raw cotton, difficult to say, massive boom. So the vast majority of it is coming from the American South. So as long as cotton keeps coming in, we've got all the mills in the world to work it, we can export it, we're growing rich, everyone's making money, life's good, what can go wrong? Just a little thing called the American Civil War, which caused a massive interruption. But actually it was just before the American Civil War, so 1861, the slave-owning southern states of America wanted to split from the rest of the United States, you know, those who pretty much opposed slave ownership. And they wanted to become an independent union, an independent country themselves. So Britain at this time pretty much owned half the world, or had certainly colonised, and it was a massive player on the world stage. And the American South knew that. And so to try and ensure that Britain didn't support the northern states in what was initially a dispute, the southern states stopped exporting cotton to Britain, hoping it would destabilise the economy and that Britain would then support the southern states to get that supply of raw cotton coming into the country again. Didn't really go to plan initially because, hold on, sorry, I just lost my, yeah, didn't really go to plan because we actually had quite a big backlog of cotton in storage, but then the American Civil War broke out, you know, properly, and so southern ports were blockaded and exports weren't going anywhere. So like I said, I mean, initially we weren't too worried because there was so much stock in British warehouses because they had actually routinely over-ordered just in case there was any break in supply for a period of time to make sure the cotton industry kept going. And that actually led the southern states to think that we needed more than we did. So we were absolutely fine for a short period of time. So then when the war broke out, the British believed it wouldn't last very long. I mean, we do have quite a history of thinking wars aren't going to last for a particularly long period of time. And we felt exactly the same about the American Civil War, but it did become clear that that wasn't going to be the case, and serious problems started. So I've mentioned the Sea Island and the Egyptians. So we're in a position where the Sea Island cotton isn't available, and there's just not enough Egyptian cotton. So it's not just Britain that's affected, all, you know, countries that imported it. So the only real alternative was called Surat cotton, and that's from India, huge quantities. There was plenty of that available, and a lot of it had been used in very small quantities in the Oldham mills previously, but it wasn't great quality. It was very short fibres, it broke very easily. So the mills were adapted, but now the mills are only producing about 40% of what they'd previously been producing. So by 1862, mills were being closed, workers are laid off. About 1/3 of cotton workers lost their jobs, had to rely on poor relief. Many went, left the area, left Oldham to go and work, a lot went to Yorkshire to work in the woolen mills. And so you may be aware that the hat making heritage of Stockport, Denton and Hydes, so they'd all been cotton factories, but they just repurposed, readapted and became then, that was their trade, the hat making. So, there was a massive problem with this unemployment. So a lot of people claimed poor relief, and, a lot of people then tried to better themselves. So like women took sewing classes, men took, other classes, learning trades and whatnot. But shock horror, there were many unemployed people who were receiving poor relief who were not attempting to better themselves. Again, Victorians, okay? Not the most sympathetic of people. And Victorians found this appalling. If you're going to get money, you're going to work for it. That's absolutely the attitude. Not very charitable, but it actually had a really beneficial knock-on effect for Oldham. So in July 1863, as a result of all this, a law came into force that allowed local authorities to borrow money to be spent on public works. Oldham took advantage of this, borrowed money to provide employment to the unemployed cotton mill workers. What do you think they built? Yes. Yes, they did.
Yeah.
So yeah. What, this plaque? Yeah, absolutely. So the land was purchased in 1863, specifically to construct a park, but the condition was that it had to be the unemployed cotton mill workers who were employed to do it. And it opened on the 28th of August, 1865. And it says, public park created as a labour project for the unemployed during the cotton famine of the American Civil War. And then it says this area used to be a speaker's corner. Yeah. We're going to throw everything. We've paid for the plaque, we're putting everything on it. But yeah, I just think a dreadful situation, but a wonderful thing to come as a result of it.
Yeah.
But again, because the Victorians were very much, you ain't getting out if you ain't doing out.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Alexandra Park. But 1864, cotton imports were reinstated and the mills began to operate once more. So Oldham and Lancashire were particularly hard hit by the cotton famine. And, quite simply, it is the sheer volume of the cotton mills that were in the region and the number of people employed in them. So at this time, there were 1,838 cotton mills in Great Britain, of which about 66% of them were in Lancashire. So other areas had other industries that they could fall back on, but Oldham and Lancashire was so reliant on it that they really suffered most when the cotton supply dried up. Remember, 30% of people in Oldham were working in cotton factories or in the cotton industry, whereas in the rest of the country, it would only be about 5% of the town's population were working in their local textile industry. So it really did hit Oldham and Lancashire really hard. Excuse me. So, the last subject is the Indian national boycott of British goods, or as I called it, Gandhi comes to town. Okay, but there was this really, really small bit of small print here, okay? I know he did come to Oldham. That is a fact, that is a historical fact, but I don't know where. I cannot find that out. I honestly tied myself a knot trying to get his itinerary or exactly where he went. So this part does refer more broadly to Lancashire, but it's still relevant, still hopefully very interesting. One side effect of Oldham and Lancashire being so massively successful in exporting their cotton all over the world was that other countries' local cotton industries suffered as a result. Lancashire cotton, it was really cheap. And there was so much of it, and it was difficult for other countries to compete, when it came to it. In 1913, 60% of Lancashire as a whole's cotton exports went to India. Remember, they've got their own cotton, the Surat cotton, but 60% of what we're producing is actually going to India. After the First World War, the Lancashire cotton industry did actually start its kind of downward trajectory, difficult to say, thank you, what Wendy said. going into an economic depression, and it was made worse in 1929 when India called for a national boycott of British cotton goods, and they actually had bonfires of Lancashire cotton throughout India. And it was all in a bid, in a call for India to get her independence, okay? So just a little bit of background. Mahatma Gandhi, Indian lawyer, politician, social activist, writer. He was the leader of the nationalist movement against the British rule in India. He believed that under British rule, you know, Indians are never going to be treated fairly, equally, the way that they should be. And he campaigned for political independence, but famously non-violence, okay? He preached nothing but non-violent means. So he started a non-violent, non-cooperation policy with the British government, and it led to a boycott of all British goods, but particularly the British textiles. And he wanted instead Indians to get back to spinning their own homegrown cotton. And he said every Indian should do this at least once a day to support our own cotton industry. So with India being one of the largest recipients of British, thus Lancashire, Oldham, cotton, the impact of the boycott was really felt hard. So we're already in an economic depression, but again, thousands of cotton mill workers lose their jobs. Cotton mills begin to close again. So Gandhi came to England in 1931. He was attending a conference with the British government, you know, to discuss Indian independence, but the British government was having none of it really at that time. But he came over, and when he was here, he was invited by cotton mill owners in Lancashire to come up to visit the area to see this devastating impact that this Indian boycott of our cotton was having on the local people. So he came up and he went to Bolton, Oldham, Burnley and Blackburn because they wanted to persuade him to call off the boycott. And so even though this boycott has caused massive suffering, economic depression, people losing their jobs, the mills closing down, he was met like a rock star. Absolute adoration. You know, they turned out locally in their thousands to see him, and I found this brilliant photo. Just love it. He's there going, what's happened? How did I end up here? But he was, you know, absolutely adored wherever he went. And he expressed, you know, so much sympathy. However, you know, he's doing this because of the hardships, the poverty, the neglect, everything that the Indians were suffering in their own country. So they weren't successful in persuading him to call off the boycott, and it actually remained in place until India retained her independence in 1947, but at which time the cotton industry in the UK was absolutely in terminal decline. Excuse me. So, literally just to finish off, so I mentioned that at the beginning of the talk that Elk Mill, largest cotton mill built in the UK, was built in 1928. And, you know, it caused a lot of surprise at the time that this massive mill was being built because of the decline in the cotton industry. It had been in depression since World War I, and it never really returned to pre-war levels. So it was mainly due to competition from other nations, India, Japan, United States of America, because they were actually investing more in new types of machinery. They had lower labour costs, and this enabled cotton to finally be produced cheaper than it was in Oldham. And there was a short boom period at the end of the Second World War caused by shortages during the war, but after 1952, the British cotton textiles, the competition from the Far East with the far lower labour costs, it just really meant there was nothing that we could do to compete with it. So it largely collapsed the cotton industry in the UK in the 20th century, which led to the decay, the neglect, the dereliction, and I've written it twice, of Lancashire's and Oldham's cotton mills. The end.